So thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Catherine Wright. I'm a senior lecturer in international politics here at Newcastle University and co-convener of the Military War and Security Research Group, and I'll be chairing today's roundtable. The event is being live streamed and will be available on YouTube afterwards. For those joining us online, if you would prefer not to be visible, please turn your camera off and ensure you remain muted. The event is sponsored by Gender Politics here at Newcastle and also the Military War Security Research Group, which is an interdisciplinary group of researchers from across the university who study military war and security issues from social science and humanities perspectives. So in so doing, they consider the military war and security issues that are ancient, historical, contemporary, and the future. And we hope that this will be one of many public-facing events that we host going forward. So this brings us to today's topic: what is the future of feminist foreign policy, and what are the implications of feminist foreign policy for peace, defence, and security? So in October 2022, Sweden dropped its headline Feminist Foreign Policy, something Sweden had been leading on since 2014. With the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time stating that the label had not served a good purpose. This coincided with the election of a new government, but also came against a wider backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine war and Sweden's resulting decision to join NATO. Following Sweden's much publicised adoption of feminist foreign policy in 2014, an increasing number of states have followed suit. I'm going to give some examples here. I'm sure I'm actually missing some. So we have Canada, Chile, France, Canada, again, Germany, Libya, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Mexico, Scotland, and Spain. This draws attention very much to the relevance of feminism to external policy and foreign policy. Yet feminist policy making in foreign policy circles is nothing new, even if it now faces new challenges. So this roundtable is part of an attempt to bring together an esteemed group of scholars, all who are working on issues related to feminist foreign policy and whom, no pressure, I hope can help us shed light on these pertinent issues. So in the middle, we have Dr. Annika Bergman-Rosamond, who is Senior Lecturer in International Relations and Gender, based at the University of Edinburgh and also affiliated with Lund. She's published extensively on feminist foreign policy, including Sweden's engagement and its role in digital diplomacy, and more broadly on gender cosmopolitanism, care, ethics, and critical military studies. And Annika also co-convenes the Gendering IR Working Group of the British International Studies Association. To my right, we have Professor Roberta Garina, who is Professor of Politics at the University of Bristol. Her research looks at the gendered nature of crisis, Brexit, and gender mainstreaming in policy areas traditionally seen as gender neutral, such as foreign policy. She's also done an incredible amount of work on the European Union from a gender perspective. Roberta is editor of the JCMS Journal of Common Market Studies. And then at the end, we have Professor Tony Hastrup, who is currently Professor of Politics at the University of Stirling and soon to take up a chair in global politics at Manchester. Her work explores the nature of global power hierarchies between the global north and south in knowledge and practice, drawing, for example, on critical feminisms to understand the foreign policy practices of the African Union and European Union institutions. So in terms of the format of the event, I'm going to ask, I've got an opening set of questions, one question for each speaker. I've told them they have a very strict 8 minutes each, because we want to keep it as discursive as possible. And I also have had a lot of very good questions submitted online, and I want to take advantage of the audience in the room. And then, so I'll ask the questions and we'll go to the audience. So Annika, you were up first. So as I said, last October, the Swedish government dropped its commitment to feminist foreign policy. At the same time, Sweden abandoned its non-aligned status in favour of NATO membership. I wonder, what does this mean for feminist foreign policy? And specifically, what does it mean for kind of feminist foreign policy now in 2023?
Thank you. That's a difficult question, of course, to answer, but I just thought I might say a few things about the Swedish context to start with, because it's the case that Sweden has both been hailed and critiqued for its feminist foreign policy. It's been celebrated as the pioneer, if you like, of feminist foreign policy, being, as Catherine said, the first state to formally adopt such a position on global politics. But when you start sort of unpacking the discursive logic surrounding Sweden's feminist foreign policy, you also see that there's been critique from other states, but also critique from within. For example, the very fact that feminist foreign policy for Sweden never entailed employing a feminist lens within the military. So feminist foreign policy was not paired with the feminist military policy. And I think some of the answers that we might be looking for, we can find in that, if you like, nexus. The fact that the government at the time, the Social Democratic government, from 2018 or so, in response to a lot of the Russian activity in the Baltic Sea region, very much put emphasis on increased military spending, starting up new regiments, encouraging the general public to sort of prepare for war and crisis, if you like. And of course, this provided a platform, if you like, for Sweden then to sell itself, to brand itself as a capable military nation, alongside with being a feminist nation. And when Russia indeed launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the kind of military preparedness that we have seen recently had already started. So the step to sort of consider and entertain and toy with the idea of NATO membership, and in so doing, letting go of non-alignment, was not all that sort of inconceivable. So we all know then that Sweden has applied for NATO membership, and from a feminist perspective, and if we sort of take cue from feminist movements and feminist activism, one might wonder whether a feminist foreign policy can exist alongside with militarism of this kind. And I think this is a question that we can ask to a range of countries that both profess to being feminist in their foreign policies, as well as, if you like, putting more money into military and defense. So with all this in mind, one might then ask questions as to why it wasn't possible for Sweden to retain a feminist foreign policy while also militarizing, given that other countries do the same. And I think that here we need to sort of think about the way in which the current conservative-led government never professed to be feminist. In fact, they were quite dismissive of feminism as a platform for foreign policy. But also during the period leading up to Sweden's membership or application for NATO membership, the Social Democratic government that had self-assigned, if you like, as a pioneer of feminist foreign policy, used explicit forms of gendered silence, in that feminism wasn't really, if you like, informing any of the discussions on NATO membership or indeed the war in Ukraine. So the Social Democrats, if you like, gave way to this new sort of turn in Swedish military policy. So what does this say about feminist foreign policy in 2023? Well, it does tell us that dabbling with just branding and branding the nation as feminist without necessarily anchoring that position within the wider public, within the electorate, is not a recipe for success. We can see that there wasn't all that much knowledge, if you like, within the public in Sweden as to what the feminist foreign policy really meant. Quite often, also, as noted earlier, feminist foreign policy was very much a branding exercise, often sort of combined with digital diplomatic practice. With that in mind, we might ask whether feminist foreign policy, whether it's Canada's or Mexico's or indeed Scotland's, can ever really take shape unless it commits itself to unpacking this very profound structural patriarchal gender relations that undergird global politics. So it needs to be much more than paying lip service to gender equality. It needs to be transformative. It needs to be anchored in the wider public. And it needs to be brave to engage in contestation and to kind of critique and unpack gendered practices, and not only doing that in relation to the global south, but to look upon oneself. What is happening within the nation's boundaries? What kind of gendered practices and gendered violence can we find within a nation? And in the Swedish case, we can, for example, identify rather high levels of gendered violence, but also a refusal on the part of a range of governments to concede to having been part of a very profound colonial exercise in the north of Europe.
Thank you, Annika. So building on Annika's kind of answer there, Tony, I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about the fact that given 5 NATO member states have adopted feminist foreign policies, what are your thoughts on whether feminist foreign policy is compatible with militarism? And relatedly, how can or perhaps should we reconcile a feminist approach to foreign policy with increased defence spending, particularly against the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine war? No easy questions today.
Really easy. Right. So, I mean, thinking about this, I think it is useful to do the academic thing of sort of disaggregating concepts, right? So we talk about now, there's a lot of talk around militarism and militarization, and they're often used interchangeably. And I think that it's useful to sort of think through both the distinctions, but also the connections between both. So when we're talking about militarism, we're sort of speaking to sort of this ideology of war making as being sort of a default answer to conflict, to trying to shore up one's national interest. And in that sense, you, of course, then want to build military capability. And I think thinking about militarism as ideology is useful because it allows us to see why and how other options are not on the table, right? And so it then is appropriate to ask, the question we're asking today, which is, when we start moving towards militarism, what does it mean for militarization, but also what does it then mean for foreign policy practice? To the question around compatibility, I guess one of the first things to say is, well, there's so much contestation, go back to Annika's term, within quote unquote regular foreign policy itself. So in a sense, when we're thinking about militarism, how that feeds into militarization, which explains the material consequences of militarism. So the increased defense spending, for example, but not just increased defense spending on specific aspects of defense spending, because a lot of things can come under defense spending, but sort of that building up armament as if the only sort of insecurity that can be faced is one that sort of requires weapons of death. So I think it's often quite useful to actually go back to feminisms and the ways in which feminists have sort of conceived of the international, the ways in which they've thought about what it is that states do in terms of defense. So by and large, most of the sort of feminist international relations canon tells us that militarism and the militarization that occurs from that is born out of patriarchy. And in that sense, then, there is no compatibility. So I wonder, is the question we should be asking about whether they are compatible or not, or rather should we be more open to living with what the contestation is? And I started thinking about this a bit more because, you know, for a very long time, those 5 states or in NATO swear by the idea of, for example, human rights. So, and to a large extent, at least in terms of foreign policy discourse, we kind of accept that these are states that are quite good on human rights. But are they really quite good on human rights? And I sort of think of feminist foreign policy in the same way. So it's my position really that in a sense, feminist foreign policy is a misnomer, because when you have, if you want the sort of transformative potential that feminism gives you, pairing it up with foreign policy doesn't quite work. So you already have the contestation there anyway without thinking about militarism at all. And then, of course, we know how feminism has been attached to different areas of foreign policy, feminist international development policy. Well, the fundamentals of international development itself is colonial. International development shouldn't exist. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that within this framework of feminist foreign policy, there is already contestation. Part of that contestation comes from the different attributions of what feminism itself is, but also it comes from the ways in which we, as citizens of these different states, identify what it is that is important to us. I don't want to go too deep because I'm not an expert on the current European conflict, Russia's aggression in Ukraine. But I think it is very useful debate to keep having. And I think that's actually the feminist thing to do, is to keep having this conversation as opposed to the binaries that we're often presented with. Either we look at all weapons in this conflict as militarism and therefore bad, and any critique of militarism and demilitarization of basically capitulating to Russia, for example. And I hope that, you know, this sort of space, but also other feminist spaces, allow us to have those sorts of debates, to think a bit more with a bit more nuance about what is it that feminism means to us, but also what are the implications of militarism, and perhaps to end on this sort of thinking about the future and going back to concepts. Often anti-militarism and pacifism are conflated. I don't necessarily think they're the same things. And perhaps again, that's another space for contestation that we should be having a conversation about. But the one thing that I'm quite clear about is that increased militarization has never led to any good. We know now, based on data that is available, that increased militarization is very, very bad for gender equality. Now, gender equality is just a tiny bit dimension of the sort of feminist foreign policy that has been articulated by countries like Germany and indeed even Sweden, as well as Canada. And so if increased militarization is bad for gender equality, there's no question, there's no compatibility with feminist foreign policy and aspirations for feminist foreign policy. But I think that the key thing is, if, depending on what side you're on, if you're the feminist, then you keep sort of trying to work through those contestations, not necessarily capitulating to, well, you know, we can't do much about it now because, you know, there's a conflict going on, but rather striving for a better world. And I think that, you know, that is the feminist ethos, right? And unfortunately, frankly, none of those 5 countries in their feminist foreign policy are there. So hope for the future, but tentative.
Tentative hope. We will latch onto that. Thank you, Tony. So Roberta, another difficult question. I wonder, what are the limits of feminist foreign policy as an approach? And we've touched on some of them but what specifically does it miss, and what alternative mechanisms might be considered to achieve a feminist transformation of foreign policy? In other words, what if not feminist foreign policy?
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. Again, not an easy set of questions, but I think easier than the previous two. And thank you, Tony and Annika, for actually setting the stage about the kind of past, present, and hopefully the future of a feminist foreign policy. Maybe big question mark there. I'm going to treat feminist foreign policy as a concept rather than a policy framework. Because I think actually a lot of the states have treated it as such. And that's what Annika was referring to when she talked about branding. So, and I think it has captured the imagination of scholars, advocates, and critics alike. And I think that is actually quite important. So in terms of setting the stage about what does it miss, I think we actually do need to look at the analysis that has been conducted of feminist foreign policy, both within the academy and outside of the academy. Who's advocating for it, who's resisting it, and why does that matter? So many of the advocates, especially practitioners of the label of feminist in terms of foreign policy, see this as an opening for advancing gender equality in areas that traditionally have been seen as gender-free or gender neutral. And I think that is actually quite important, and it has been an opening. Indeed, it has piqued the interest and the eye, it's caught the eye of many academics and practitioners, not known in the past for their work or concern with issues of gender or intersectionality. And I think that actually is quite important. And what is particularly interesting is that there is a booming field of feminist foreign policy analysis. Annika, Tony, Catherine here are key examples of that. But many of the more mainstream scholars who are now engaging with feminist foreign policy fail to cite feminist scholars and fail to cite the work that has gone before, that actually set the grounds. So I think we actually need to be mindful of that, because it tells us something quite significant about the longevity of this concept and this policy frame. So we have seen, and talking to some colleagues and friends, I've been told, and by the way, I fundamentally disagree with them, that I should be happy because people are being more aware of the issue. And I think we need to be mindful of the politics of citation and the way that issues get sidetracked by a field that develops without being mindful to and acknowledging the work that has gone before. So we have seen much greater engagement with gender issues from corners of the discipline that might not have been so curious about these issues a few years ago. Interestingly, many of them, as part of their deep dive into feminist foreign policy, are choosing not to cite the feminist and gender literature that has gone before. But this is, again, something for a different talk, and I'm happy to answer more questions on that. Practitioners have also been curious, if a little bit cautious, about the label. Many wondering if and how can we develop a feminist foreign policy that goes alongside normal foreign policy. And this is a question I've actually been asked. So how can we actually have this dual track foreign policy, a feminist foreign policy that informs real foreign policy? Kind of missing the point, right? But it has opened a space for a conversation. And I think that is potentially the biggest value of feminist foreign policy, the opening that has created to have the discussion. Let's talk about the critics. And I think here we need to be mindful. I'm not a fan of the label and the way that it has been implemented or operationalized, largely because it misses something quite significant about power. And I'm also not a fan because of the way that the critics, especially in the political sphere, have been using it. And they've actually used it as a way, as another topic to pour fuel on the fire of the culture wars, if you wish, to justifying silencing gender to the equality agenda. And it's very, very narrowly interpreted equalities agenda. And we're seeing this as a reification of binaries in a way that is actually not helpful to anyone. So to go back to the limitations of feminist foreign policy, what I think we need to start with is to recognize the feminist foreign policy set out a framework for integrating not just the gender sensitive perspective, but a feminist perspective in foreign policy. So let's kind of go back to what Annika and Tony were saying. Labels matter. In the label, we have a commitment to social, political, and economic transformation. With that comes to really capture what Tony and Annika were saying earlier, reflexivity. It captures inclusion. It also, I would argue, it captures 4 E's: equity, emancipation, empathy, and an ethic of care. Without those, it cannot be feminist. So we actually need to really focus on what it means when this label, this branding becomes co-opted. And here we really need to turn to the critiques of the WPS agenda, which has been seen as being co-opted, and the limitations that has actually engendered. So the priorities here, yes, protect women's rights, protect being a key word in that, promote gender equality, but how is that defined? And increase participation, and all too often at the expense of representation. So the two not actually seen together. So the foreign in feminist foreign policy is often centered in the discourse, and it is applied to external facing domains such as diplomacy, security, defense. As Tony mentioned as well, international development. Interestingly enough, all too often people don't talk about trade when they talk about feminist foreign policy. So what there is very little consideration of, however, is the idea that you can have a feminist notion of power. Because after all, feminism is about power. It is about understanding how power manifests in everyday securities and insecurities, in everyday politics and interactions. So feminist power understood as power to and power with, power that enables rather than power over. So what happens, therefore, when we have feminist power and it becomes aligned to a liberal understanding of feminism, which focuses all too often on access rather than transformation. And in many ways, I would say that is probably the single biggest limitation of feminist foreign policy, because in this context, feminist foreign policy becomes a tool for the pursuit of the state's foreign policy and it's the state status, as opposed to transformation, which is at the core of what feminism is supposed to be as a political, ideologically driven project. So what are the alternatives? And I'm kind of going to go back to something that we've all forgotten, seemingly, and that is gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming, introduced in 1995 at the Beijing conference, seems to have been forgotten in recent years, often deemed to be too technocratic, too much of a tick box exercise. All of those are fair criticisms. However, we've also forgotten the analysis of people like Judith Squires, who highlighted the transformational potential of gender mainstreaming as a policy framework and strategy. So, gender mainstreaming calls for gender to be treated as a cross-cutting issue, to be included in all policy domains, to understand the interaction and the connections, almost like a social network, of how the external and the internal constantly operate in support of each other. And in that, I would argue then it also opens a space for the creation of feminist triangles within institutions within the state. It's not a fix, it's not a transformative it's not necessarily a transformative kind of approach, but it is a pathway to actually include the issues, to actually create alliances between civil society, epistemic communities, and femocrats and actually embed it within a more long-term transformative agenda that actually has implications for the everyday. So in that regard, I would say in terms of what are the alternatives, I think it's time to rediscover gender mainstreaming as a way to actually ensure that gender and equalities plus are included in all policy domains.
Good, thank you. So I have questions. I have lots of questions submitted in advance, but I'm keen to let people in the audience, both in person and also online, ask their questions. So I'll grab my laptop in a minute. So if you have a question and you're online, then please just post it in the chat and we'll get to you. But does anyone in the audience physically have a question? Or I can start us off. I'll start us off. Here we go. So we've got a couple of related questions here I'm going to ask you. So one is from Celine Wang, who's from Newcastle. Celine asks, how can feminist policies avoid being patriarchal? And Celine means that in terms of the degrees of development between different countries as it spreads internationally. And then there's a question from Aditi Gupta from Protection Approaches and Minorities and Peace and Security. And Aditi asks, how can we ensure that feminist foreign policy lives up to its decolonial roots? And how do we hold policymakers to account for that? Who would like to start us off?
Ready? Great. So just to clarify, was the last question about feminist foreign policy specifically, or just like
feminist foreign policy, yeah, living up to its decolonial roots, and how do we hold policymakers to account for that?
Right. So I mean, I would argue that feminist foreign policy has no decolonial roots at all. I mean, I think we would want it to. Not necessarily have decolonial roots, because I also think that decoloniality is used for a lot of things that it isn't. I think certainly a lot of the members of civil society, both in the global north and in the global majority, are advocating that if you take decoloniality seriously, then you will think about feminist foreign policy differently. And if you really integrate that, if we integrate that into our frameworks, then we would do feminist foreign policy differently. So you can see, for example, in the most recent German guidelines, that there's more of an articulation of what we might begin to pay attention to if we take seriously some of the decolonial critiques. So I think the question then is, to what extent are states, as they are, willing to give space for those sort of critiques to then be reflected in their policy practices? If I use the German example, I would say, of course, it remains to be seen how that will actually happen, even though, of course, in terms of the actual framework, there's a lot of discussion around it. I think it's also important to note, going back to my earlier point, that if feminist foreign policy is the tool of the state design, the Westphalian state design, is antithetical to the sort of decolonial, anti-colonial thinking that we might want. So again, here you have a tension. Can the state, or the different states as they exist, can they really do this decolonial work as we might expect it? Or is it about the sort of different actors that are tasked with foreign policy doing this work? So in this sense, I look at, for example, Global North civil society organizations. A lot of Global North civil society organizations have pivoted towards feminist foreign policy because, frankly, there seems to be a bit of money in it. And, it's a good way to get resources to do some of the other work you might do, including organizations that have absolutely no feminist bones in them. But in doing feminist foreign policy, we would expect then that your overall practice is feminist. But that is not necessarily the case. And I think, but this is, I think, the sphere in which we can begin to sort of demand more of more anti-colonial responsibilities, frankly, where it's not necessarily constrained by the state. But I'm not convinced that the state, any of those states, are actually able to colonial.
Does anyone else want to come in there? Or we have a lot of other questions. Does anyone in the audience have a question? If not, I have a few online. So Jennifer Thompson from the University of Bath says, great discussion. I'd like to ask Roberta to expand on her point on citation. I'd also be interested to hear the panelists' thoughts on something else Roberta mentioned. Where are trade agreements in this? And Jennifer's thinking about the gender and trade agreement that seems to exist alongside feminist foreign policy, but not really in conversation with it. And then there's a lot of question marks.
I'll start with on the politics of citations. So there's been, thanks Jennifer for that. So in terms of the politics of citations, what we are saying is the issue of gender and feminist foreign policy have triggered an interest among some mainstream scholars who have not historically have had a particular feminist curiosity in issues around gender inequalities more or intersectionality or the colonial approaches. What I find quite interesting is that in the way that these colleagues engage and some of the work that is starting to emerge fails to engage with or build upon what has gone before. So, and here I'm really thinking about the field that I most frequently engage with, which is EU studies. And what we're finding is that people reinvent the wheel, and there is no engagement with the body of work that has emerged over the last 30 years in relations to gender and the EU, gender and foreign policy, gender and international relations. Admittedly, gender and foreign policy, as you've also written about, is one of the areas that has the least amount of literature that has emerged over time. However, there are some scholars like yourself, like Annika, like Karen Agastam, and so on, who have engaged with both fields. And all too often, it is the work of those scholars that is marginalized and not cited in the process of recreating the knowledge around gender in external affairs, gender in foreign policy. And what I'm finding actually, we've done a detailed analysis of this for UASIS. What we're finding is that all too often this work is about women and foreign policy, women and international development, or gender in foreign policy, as opposed to understanding gender as a lens through which we look at the world. It becomes very much a variable at different levels, and implicitly it reproduces binaries, it reproduces hierarchies, and it does not acknowledge the work that has gone before. And I think, kind of going back to what Tony was saying about feminist practice, that we expect to see from civil society organizations who are claiming to embed the work of feminist foreign policy, we would also want to say that if people are engaging with feminist work and doing feminist research, not only do they adhere to feminist ethics, but also engage with the feminist literature and engage with the politics of citation.
Thank you. You can come in and we can get more questions.
I'd quite like to say a few things on trade, if that's okay, because one of the endeavors of Sweden's feminist foreign policy at the time of its inception was indeed to conduct a feminist trade policy under the leadership of former Foreign Minister Ann Linde. That in itself is not a bad thing, if indeed, again, it was rooted in some form of commitment to actually transform the inequalities in the global economy. But quite often, on her travels and in her speeches, there is a lot of emphasis on women's entrepreneurship in the global south, and assuming that if you just got women specifically into the global economy, but quite often into very small scale projects that would not generate an awful lot of income, and assume that they are first and foremost neoliberal subjects, if you like, entrepreneurial, then I think that feminist trade policy is very much missing the mark. It's not how we transform the current inequalities. So a feminist trade policy needs to be, like Roberta said, very paired with forms of gender mainstreaming, but also to be brave in the sense that you try to unpack the sort of the logic, for example, of free trade agreements that often are extremely gendered and don't do an awful lot at all to help women in particular. So a very sort of a critique of the neoliberal underpinnings that I don't think was present, at least in Sweden's attempt to conduct this kind of trade policy. Rather, it was paired with another identity marker of Sweden, which is the modern industrial nation, the green state wedded to green steel production, for example. So, and that was never really deconstructed. So I think this is a problem. Feminist trade policy needs to be brave.
Thank you. Zorana, do you take both?
Okay. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your insightful thoughts. My question relates to something that all of you have touched upon earlier, is that it's the neoliberal critique of feminist foreign policy, right? And you, Annika, talked about trade, but you, Tony, also mentioned, civil society and how, there are so many actors now that, we will do a bit of feminist foreign policy because there's a little bit of money. So I was just wondering if you could expand on this, like what would do to feminist foreign policy if civil societies or civil society actors just, are in this because it's trendy. Right.
Yeah, thanks. Really enjoyed all of your interventions. My question is kind of from Tony was speaking about Russia and militarism, and I still don't really know what a feminist response to the war in Russia is, except to maybe think about it, or to divide militarism and forms of militarism to, the kind of defensive militarization and aggressive militarization, which of course are not indistinguishable from each other. But I guess, if there's one critique of the war in Russia that one can make, is certainly the, this big strongman masculinity and expansionism from which it stems. But from beyond that, I'm not really sure what the, I'm from Finland, so it's also been a very close to home topic. What as a feminist, what should I be fighting for here, apart from, some obvious things about how, war is conducted and so on. But yeah, so I don't know if that was a very clear question, but
It's a good one.
Thank you. And actually, both your questions tie in with two of the questions we've had online. So clearly, they're very topical. Who would like to start us off?
Did you want to say the two questions from online, or do you want to wait?
I can say the two questions online.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we have, and apologies if I pronounce your name incorrectly, Annalise Cosens. She's a student at Oxford, and she's writing her dissertation on the extent feminist foreign policy can be actively implemented and used during a political crisis with a case study of Ukraine. She's curious to know if feminist foreign policy can be used to reduce conflict and wars, especially given many states are still in the drafting phase of feminist policy rather than the implementation phase. And then Columba Equilissal says, fascinating discussion. Thanks all. And to riff off Jennifer, she just agrees with kind of the thing on trade, but linked to Sorana's point, Columba also asks, in relation to civil society, do they embrace or reject the opportunity feminist foreign policy presents to try and enlist the state for their own purposes, whilst potentially risking the further depoliticization and co-optation of feminist principles, or must they reject feminist foreign policy altogether? And then her final question is, do we really want to embrace feminist foreign policy? Exclamation mark, question mark.
Right. Okay.
Asking now.
But I can start if that's okay, and I'll probably sort of go on tangents and then someone else can sort of pick up on it. But to your question, I have a problem with this idea that there has to be a feminist response to what is going on in Ukraine. You know, at this moment in time, I'm a panelist. When I go outside that door, I assume another identity to whoever it is that I'm interacting with. So the idea that you have to have, I mean, I think it's useful to sort of have a basis for what it is that you believe and what it is that you do. But this idea that we have to have a feminist response, I find it very problematic. And part of why I find it very problematic, again, is because of my own positionality. Because for years, and maybe this links back to the earlier question that Jennifer asked around, so perhaps less about citation politics and more about knowledge production. In a lot of the work that I've been doing around foreign policy itself, in that context, barring perhaps Nigeria and South Africa, the rest of the 52 African countries don't do foreign policy. If I was simply to listen to the literature on foreign policy and foreign policy analysis. But somehow, I know that these African countries have foreign policies. I know that feminists have been talking about the foreign policy practices of their countries, that has had an impact, negative and positive, in terms of what it is that those states do about the practices in the neighborhood, but also in the global political system. We do not integrate those knowledges, even within feminist foreign policy, into our analysis. Why not? I mean, I can't answer that question now, but it's there. And so if we're talking about militarism and Ukraine, it's very easy, for example, the stuff you hear is Russia disinformation is so good in places like Africa, that's why they're doing X, Y, Z, or that's why they're not doing X, Y, Z. And I find that really problematic because actually feminists too, in these other spaces in the Middle East, they're watching this and they're engaging with the contestations that some of us don't seem to want to engage with here in the global north. So I think it's completely okay to be conflicted. So I always say, I'm very, very pro demilitarization because it has never done anything good in my lifetime, but I'm not a pacifist. And part of why I'm not a pacifist, right, is because I lived in a military dictatorship. Those two things can exist at the same time. And I think global north feminists are not willing to engage with that. But I also actually think a lot of non-global north feminists allow themselves to be drawn into this conversation about the binary. You're either for or against. I think it's completely okay to be conflicted. So keep on being conflicted. To Columba's CSOs and then to Columba's question. So for me, part of feminist practice, especially from feminists in the global north, is you need to, if you're thinking about feminism and you're thinking seriously about power, you need to be willing to give space. So I sort of come from a perspective of CSOs that work in Africa. I don't think CSOs should reject the feminist foreign policy framework. I, for example, don't believe in a definition of feminist foreign policy. I think that it can be a framework of a set of things, of a set of principles that states can enact. Ignoring that it exists and not engaging with it, for me, is burying your head in the sand. And if we can't, we don't do that for regular foreign policy because we think it's ethically corrupt to not do that, to sort of ignore what it is that the state is doing, then why would we do that for feminist foreign policy? So my sense is that it's quite possible that as a feminist, all I ever do with feminist foreign policy is critique it. I think that, that should be okay alongside those people who accept feminist foreign policy for what it is. And some people do. Those people I continue to critique. But I would never not engage in feminist foreign policy as it exists, because it also has the potential to cause harm.
Can I build on that?
Yeah.
And actually, I want to link it to the question about neoliberal critiques. And actually, I would say how neoliberalism has hijacked the concept of feminism and neoliberal feminism and the danger of that. And I think feminist foreign policy, as currently conceived by the vast majority of states that have actually started to try and formulate what it means, is rooted not just in liberal but neoliberal principles. And hence, some of the work we've done really draws attention to the fact that when organizations or states focus on feminist foreign policy, they focus on issues like empowerment, access. It's almost as if they bought into the kind of this is the girl boss moment of foreign policy, right? Which is problematic, right? So it's not just about the label. At the same time, I'm an optimist at heart. So I actually agree with Tony. This is a moment as well, right? So people are interested, and that's why I was saying about the politics of citations. I think it is important to draw attention about hierarchies in knowledge production processes. But it is also a moment because it actually has opened a space to hear some, not all, but some critical voices. And then it is on us in terms of embedding feminist praxis in the way that we do the research, that we also speak, civil societies, the way they also practice to give space. So that's kind of the point that I was making about power and power to and power with, right? It's a different notion of power. And on the issue of Russia, I agree with Tony. I think it's not about having a feminist perspective on Russia, but it is about applying gender sensitive lenses to understanding what is going on in Russia. And you highlighted, the kind of strongman masculinity. But I think it goes deeper than that, right? And the failures of states to recognize the unintended gender harm that came with the start of the war, for instance, with the relocation policies, which didn't take into consideration safeguarding concerns. And I mean, that's unintended harm, but it is real harm, just like we saw with COVID, right? Not actually looking ahead and understanding how gender manifests in those kind of crisis situations I think is negligent now. And I think we need to call it for that. So I think we need to ditch the unintended and actually focus on the negligence of it. But also the fact that it is assumed that men will fight, right? Men not being able to leave Ukraine, because it is assumed that male bodies are dispensable. And I think that's also gender analysis that we need to apply. And then, the impact that has in terms of militarization of society in post-conflict environments. What's going to happen when the war ends and we have a highly militarized, highly weaponized society? And what is the gendered harm that will come from that? So those are the kind of questions that I think we need to start asking. I'm not the one who to answer them, because there are people who are doing absolutely amazing work on this. And those are the people who actually really we need to turn to. But in that context, really opening up the box to start having that conversation now.
Like that.
Yeah, I just wanted to also say a few words about Russia and Ukraine. One of the things that we can do, of course, as feminists is to engage in the act of listening, so that myself, I'm part of a network of scholars bringing together Ukrainian scholars and scholars of the global north, of the West, and we meet once a month to talk about the war, but trying to shut up, if you like, as a Western person, but actually to engage in that listening and to really hear about what people so deeply affected by the war want us to do, rather than having some a priori notion of what I should be doing. So to respond, and I think it's one of the quandaries here, of course, is that it's very easy for somebody relatively safe like myself to bang on about the militarism and you know, but that could also mean or entail that I deny somebody else to defend their actual existence in the final analysis. And I think you have to be very cautious here, so you don't sort of take that right to defend yourself away from somebody because of your own feminist positioning, if you like. And of course, I'm also deeply affected by this with Sweden really trying hard to enter NATO and to find some form of ontological security, at least among some people. In terms of civil society, I have noticed, I have to say, the number of requests one gets to talk about feminist foreign policy here, there, and everywhere. And you could see that as co-optation. But given that one of the problems with Swedish feminist foreign policy, which is the only feminist foreign policy that has actually been abandoned thus far, is the lack of engagement and rootedness in civil society. And that could be said for the WPS agenda too. So I think we can sort of accept that perhaps some sort of co-optation might be needed, but I think more civil society rather than less civil society, in my view.
Thank you. That brings us to time. This was quite a short and snappy roundtable, so I think we've answered a lot of questions, but there are still lots of other questions out there. So if you want to join me in thanking Tony, Annika and Roberta, and thanks everyone for your excellent questions.